Hey everybody, this is Chris coming to you live from the library on behalf of Cinephellas, the only website for all your cinephilic needs. And yes, I am dressed a little different this week. Thank you so much for asking. You know, usually I'm dressed in my buttoned up pretentious best, but this week I'm wearing my Revolver t-shirt. Ooh. It's the cover art that was designed by the late Klaus Voormann. And if you don't know Klaus, you should really look him up. He's this sort of unsung hero in the Beatles story as well as in many of their solo careers. And I'm rocking this t-shirt because... Ringo, what's so funny?
We play marbles.
Okay, that's really great, George, but I'm trying to do a video here for Cinephellas. I'm reviewing the new Ron Howard directed documentary. It's called The Beatles, 8 Days a Week, The Touring Years. You know, you were there, so it's about you. Just relax. I'm trying to do this video.
Oh, we're having a great time.
Okay, that's great. Well, you keep up the fun, and we're just gonna roll on here, okay? We'll check back in with you later on. Okay. So while George and Ringo do their thing, let's get down to business, shall we? So as I was saying, I'm rocking this t-shirt because I'm reviewing The Beatles' 8 Days a Week, The Touring Years, the new documentary directed by Ron Howard. So Ron Howard is known for many things, right? He played Opie on the Andy Griffith Show, and of course he played the legendary Richie Cunningham on Happy Days, still one of my favorite television shows of all time. And he went on to direct several hugely successful films, including Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, and The Da Vinci Code, along with the subsequent films in that series. But 8 Days a Week is Ron Howard's passion project. He's a lifelong fan of the Beatles, so when he had the opportunity to make this documentary, he was all in and partnered with Hulu to distribute the film to online audiences all over the world at the same time it hit theaters. So the story behind this film is actually really fascinating. It looks at a very underrepresented part of the Beatles' career, namely the earlier years from about 1961 to 1966. And it all started when Matthew White, who was working at National Geographic at the time, discovered old footage of the Beatles in one of their archives, and he started from there looking at other places that might have Beatles footage, such as police archives, 8mm film transfer houses, and in fans' homes, so home movies. It was a real collaborative effort to make this film. Matthew White's company that he founded called One Voice, One World with two partners, and the Beatles' own Apple Corps joined together in collaboration with tons of private Beatles fans and collectors from all over the globe. They used modern approaches of tracking down all these different parties using Facebook, Twitter, and several other social media platforms to get the conversation started and accumulate resources. Eventually, a formal research space was established at the University of Maryland to gather supplemental information and sort of fill in the holes of the information they did have. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of White Horse Pictures, which is a Hollywood production company that already had a vested interest in Beatles-related history, having produced Martin Scorsese's 2011 documentary about George Harrison, which is titled Living in the Material World. Perhaps that will be a subject of a future review. Super exciting, just thought of that right now. White Horse helped gather interviewees that experienced the Beatles' touring years firsthand, and also organized interviews with the surviving Beatles, Paul and Ringo. John and George do appear in the film through archival interview footage that spans from the 60s to 1980 in the case of John Lennon, and from the 60s to the late 90s or so for George Harrison. The existing performance footage is digitally restored for the film, so it looks and sounds amazing. And the biggest treat is the restored version of the Beatles' legendary 30-minute set at New York's Shea Stadium, which they performed in August 1965. If you go see the film, most of the screenings show the 30-minute set afterwards, and it's a real treat. It sounds great, it looks great, and it's a really interesting look into this huge pop culture moment. So, an overview of the film. As I said, it takes place chronologically from about 1961, when the Beatles played their first shows in Hamburg, Germany, to their 1966 tour when it wraps up in San Francisco's Candlestick Park. This roughly translates to the first shows they ever played, how Ringo joined the band, and ends with the Beatles in the studio after they soar off touring right before they released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. But most of the film is a look at their initial rise to fame and the accompanying tours of the United States, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the Philippines, just to name a few. The film covers the band's personal thoughts on landing in New York City and playing The Ed Sullivan Show for the first time in 1964. Very historic moment. And it also gives us behind-the-scenes footage of the making of the Beatles' first two theatrical films, A Hard Day's Night and Help. Help is my favorite. It just has a really interesting aesthetic. Purists would probably say A Hard Day's Night. The film kind of takes a look at the Beatles from these rough young rockers to mainstream pop superstars through the eyes of many of those that helped them get their careers going, including Brian Epstein, their manager, George Martin, their producer, and the band's road crew. 8 Days a Week also spends time diving into controversial moments during the Beatles' early years that sometimes get overlooked in other books and documentaries. For instance, they pay a lot of attention in the film to how John Lennon's off-the-cuff statement that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus impacted the decision to stop touring. And there's even some interesting backstory on the infamous Butcher album cover, now one of the most highly sought-after music collectibles in the world. I have a copy of it that was passed down to me from my father, and it's worth a pretty penny. So check that out on collectors' websites.
We were just having a good laugh and everyone seemed to enjoy it. So we had a good time, you know. What's the point in being serious all the time?
Well, there it is. You heard it from the man himself. But though they dive into existing phenomenon in Beatles history, fans of the Beatles anthology documentary, the 8-part doc that came out in the late 90s, won't necessarily find it repetitive, as we add a lot of new information and zero in on things, such as the young boys having fun. We get a real sense of who they were as comedians in their early years, and their maturity into serious artists. And the film is also really important because it situates the Beatles' rise to fame in larger historical context. Now, they come to the United States in early 1964, and we have to remember, this is just a few months after JFK is assassinated. This is right before America goes full tilt into Vietnam, and the war starts in 1965. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed by LBJ that year, which was very historic because it outlined discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It was one of the first major moves to end institutional racism in the United States. And through 8 Days a Week, we get insight on how the Beatles played a small part in those changes. They spoke out against racial segregation very vehemently, and even put a provision in their contract at the time saying that they would not play segregated venues. That was the first time a major rock band spoke out against such high-profile political issues. And by doing so, also became the first pop culture stars to become spokespeople for the younger generation. Yes, this is the very same time when political folk music in Greenwich Village and later in the Southern California area had been targeting highly sensitive political issues. Think here of artists like Joan Baez, think early Bob Dylan. You know, these artists were performing topical songs, but the folk movement had little range, right? In no way did it have the mainstream visibility that the Beatles did in the early 1960s. So this meant that the Beatles were in a unique position to lend their voices and beliefs to these hot-button issues. In one of the film's many interview segments, historian Kitty Oliver recounts her experience going to see the Beatles play the first integrated concert at Jacksonville, Florida's Gator Bowl, which is a very historic moment. And those segments where they interview everyday people and sort of stars that are not necessarily musicians really help you see what a force the Beatles were at the time. So their cultural impact extended into the lives of comedians like Whoopi Goldberg and Eddie Izzard, journalist Larry Kane, intellectual Malcolm Gladwell, actor Sigourney Weaver, and music historian John Savage. All of them attest to how the Beatles influenced their lives and the world around them.
You know, rather than sort of being struggling unknowns and trying to do things that we'd never be able to do, we can now do more things that we'd like to.
That's right. So I give the Beatles 8 days a week, the touring years, 5 out of 5 hair pieces. Why do I do so? Well, this film provides an in-depth look at an often ignored period in the Beatles' career. Usually discussions of the band focus more on their later, more artistic period when they became rock stars, but there's no doubting that the final years of their short career were astoundingly innovative. But 8 days a week shows us that John, Paul, George, and Ringo might not have developed their art politically, musically. They might not have developed as such without those first touring years, specifically 1964 to 1966. Plus, the film shows us a fuller portrait of a band that were revolutionaries almost from the very beginning. And oftentimes, we only kind of see that in the later years when John Lennon meets Yoko Ono and they go on protests such as the Bed In for Peace. Now, there's also a companion live album being released with the film. It's a remastered recording of the band's 1965 concert at the Hollywood Bowl. So make sure you check it out, turn it up, and rock out. And as always, don't forget to share a movie, and in this case, the album, with someone you love. Hey boys, how was that game of marbles?
You know, I like to have it all vague.
Phew. Looks like it's gonna be a hard day's night. This is Chris for Cinephellas. See you next time.